Your Grace, she's only a maid.
No, she is not, Your Majesty.
Mother, what are you saying? Ever to—
Money buys a lot of things. A title, a sprawling estate choking on its own damp ivy, a fiancé who smells like desperation and crushed roses. But when the Duke brought his bride home, he learned the one thing money couldn't buy: his mother's knees bending to the right woman. The carriage rattled. It was an incessant, bone-shaking vibration that traveled up through the velvet cushions and settled directly in the base of Gideon's skull. The suspension was shot. Everything in the Vale family was shot, rotting, or heavily mortgaged, a fact completely obscured by the heavy gold crest painted on the carriage door. Rain lashed the glass. Inside, the air was thick, suffocatingly warm, and heavy with the scent of wet wool and Diana's lavender water. Diana talked. She had not stopped talking since they left London. I told the dressmaker we would need yards of the Brussels lace, not the French. French is entirely too common now, don't you think? Diana adjusted the cuffs of her traveling gown. The silk rustled, a dry, papery sound that set Gideon's teeth on edge. And for the reception, I was thinking swans, or perhaps peacocks on the lawn. What does your mother prefer? My mother prefers silence, Gideon said. He didn't open his eyes. He let his head rest against the damp carriage wall, feeling the chill of the glass seep into his hair. Diana let out a short, high-pitched laugh that held no humor. It was the laugh of a woman who had bought a duke and was still trying to figure out how to unwrap him. You're terrible. She's going to adore me. My father assured me that the Dowager Duchess is a woman of immense practical sense. Practical sense. That was one word for it. Catherine, Dowager Duchess of Vale, was a woman carved from flint and old resentments. Not. She had survived a husband who drank his weight in claret and gambled away the southern farmlands. She had survived the scarlet fever that took 3 of her children, leaving only Gideon. She did not have time's practical sense. She had fangs. In the far corner of the carriage, pressed as tightly against the mahogany paneling as humanly possible, sat Anna. Gideon opened one eye and looked at her, Diana's lady's maid. She was a small, severe-looking thing. She wore a drab gray wool coat that smelled faintly of lye soap and old wood smoke. A heavy leather bandbox containing Diana's monstrous feathered hats was balanced precariously on her knees. Anna's hands were bare, her knuckles were white, the skin red and raw from the cold. She didn't look out the window. She didn't look at Gideon. She stared at a loose thread on the carpet, her breathing shallow and perfectly timed to the rattling of the wheels. She existed in that deliberate state of invisibility that only seasoned servants and hunted animals ever truly master. Anna, Diana snapped, not looking at the girl. You're letting the box tilt. If you crush the osprey feathers, I will dock your wages for the month. Do you hear me? Anna shifted her grip. The leather creaked. Yes, miss, she murmured. Her voice was flat, hoarse. Gideon watched a drop of rainwater leak through the carriage roof and splash onto Anna's shoulder. She didn't flinch. She just let the dark stain spread across the gray wool. Gideon felt a flicker of something. Pity, perhaps, or just exhaustion. He looked away. He had no room for pity. He was marrying Diana for her father's steel mills, for the soot-stained money that would fix the leaking roofs of his ancestral home. He was selling his title for copper pipes and a replenished wine cellar. He had no moral high ground to judge anyone from. The carriage lurched, throwing Diana forward against Gideon's chest. She smelled of mint pastilles and anxiety. We're here, Gideon said, untangling himself from her silks. He peered out the window. The rain had turned the gravel drive into a gray soup. At the end of the avenue stood Highfield Hall. It was a massive looming structure of blackened stone, surrounded by skeletal oak trees. There were no lights in the upper windows. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum waiting for its next occupant. Oh, Diana breathed. The word was small, stripped of her usual bravado. She pressed her gloved hand against the glass. It's very large. It's a ruin, Gideon corrected flatly. Mind the steps. The stone is slick. The footman opened the door, letting in a blast of freezing wind that smelled of wet earth and dying leaves. Gideon stepped out first. His boots sank an inch into the mud. He winced, then turned to offer his hand to his fiancée. Diana descended, squeaking as her velvet hem dragged across the dirty wheel spoke. Anna scrambled out last, clutching the heavy bandbox to her chest. She slipped on the metal step, her knee hitting the carriage frame with a dull, sickening thud. Gideon instinctively reached out a hand, but Anna caught herself. She didn't cry out. She just swallowed hard, her jaw tightening, and stepped down into the mud, ignoring the pain. She kept her eyes glued to the gravel. "Don't dawdle, Anna," Diana hissed, shaking the wet from her skirts. "Bring the bags up, and for God's sake, don't look so miserable. We are meeting a duchess." They walked up the wide stone steps. The massive oak front doors were already open. Standing in the threshold, framed by the dim, flickering light of the cavernous entrance hall, was his mother. Dowager Duchess Catherine wore black. She always wore black, an endless mourning period not for her late husband, but for the era of dignity that she felt had died with him. The heavy mourning silk absorbed the light. Her white hair was pulled back into a severe knot. She leaned on an ebony cane with a silver handle, though Gideon knew she didn't actually need it to walk. She used it to punctuate her displeasure. The foyer smelled of beeswax, cold ash, and centuries of decaying tapestries. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ticking of a massive grandfather clock in the shadows. "Mother," Gideon said, stepping out of the rain and into the gloom. He bowed his head slightly. Catherine didn't look at him. Her eyes, pale and sharp as shattered glass, locked immediately onto Diana. Diana stepped forward, a broad, nervous smile plastered across her face. She dropped into a curtsy. It was too deep, too theatrical, a performance learned from a dancing master rather than born of instinct. Her heavy silk skirts pooled around her on the damp flagstones. "Your Grace," Diana said, her voice echoing too loudly in the hollow space. "It is the greatest honor of my life to finally meet you. Gideon has told me so much about your immense, practical sense." Gideon closed his eyes briefly. "Idiot." Catherine stood perfectly still. The silence stretched. It pulled tight, thin as wire. 3 seconds, 5 seconds. The grandfather clock ticked. Diana, still holding the deep curtsy, began to wobble. The muscles in her calves trembled. Her smile strained, cracking at the edges. Slowly, deliberately, Catherine let her gaze drag over Diana. She looked at the expensive, gaudy lace. She looked at the overly curled hair plastered to Diana's forehead by the damp air. She looked at the smudged mud on the hem of the velvet. It was an autopsy, performed by eyesight alone. "You wear too much lavender," Catherine said finally. Her voice was quiet, raspy, like dry leaves scraping across a stone tomb. "It covers the smell of the tanneries, I suppose. You may stand." Diana scrambled upright, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. She opened her mouth, closed it, and looked at Gideon in panic. Gideon offered nothing. He stared at a spot on the wall. This was the transaction. Blood for money. Humiliation was just the tax. "Let us get this over with," Catherine muttered, turning her back on them to head toward the drawing room. But as she turned, her cane paused in the air. Anna had just stepped over the threshold. The maid was drenched. Her drab gray coat was dark with rain. She stood near the heavy wooden door, dripping onto the stone floor. The large leather bandbox still clamped in her red, raw hands. She had her head bowed, staring at the floorboards, waiting for permission to carry the luggage to the servants' quarters. Catherine froze. The tip of the ebony cane hit the stone floor with a sharp times clack. Gideon frowned. He watched his mother's spine stiffen, It wasn't her usual posture of aristocratic disdain. It was something else, a physical jolt. Catherine turned back around. Slowly. She completely ignored Diana, who was still sputtering, trying to form a polite sentence about the weather. Catherine took a step toward the doorway. Then another. "Mother?" Gideon asked, stepping forward. Catherine raised her left hand, a sharp, violent motion demanding absolute silence. Her pale eyes were wide, fixed entirely on the shivering maid in the corner. Anna felt the stare. Servants always know when they are being watched. She shrank back, pressing her spine against the freezing stone wall. She finally lifted her head, her dull gray eyes meeting the Dowager Duchess's face. Gideon saw the exact moment it happened. He saw Anna's breath stop. He saw the maid's knuckles turn from white to a bloodless, terrifying yellow. The heavy leather bandbox slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a loud, hollow thud. Diana's precious hats were crushed, but no one looked at the box. Catherine was trembling. The Iron Woman, the widow who hadn't shed a tear when they lowered her 3 children into the crypt, was shaking. Her breathing became ragged, audible gasps in the quiet hall. She walked until she was mere inches from the maid. "Hey," Diana snapped, her shock finally giving way to indignation. "She is dripping on your floor. Your Grace. Anna, pick up the box immediately." "Quiet," Catherine whispered. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. Catherine stared into Anna's face. She looked at the slope of the girl's jaw, the exact curve of her brow, the small, crescent-shaped scar beneath her left eye. Anna swallowed. Her throat clicked in the silence. She looked terrified, trapped. "Please," the maid whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, don't." It was an impossible request. Catherine dropped her cane. It clattered loudly against the stone, rolling away into the shadows. Then, the Dowager Duchess of Vale took a step back. She gathered the heavy black mourning silk of her skirts in both of her wrinkled, liver-spotted hands. Gideon's heart stopped. "No, it's impossible." Catherine's knees bent. Her joints popped a loud, sickening sound in the cold air. She sank toward the floor. She did not give a polite nod. She did not offer the shallow, dignified dip of a senior aristocrat. Catherine lowered herself into a full, deep, unbroken court curtsy, the kind reserved only for an anointed sovereign. She went so low her black skirts spread across the muddy, wet flagstones, soaking into the puddles left by the maid's boots. She bowed her head, exposing the nape of her neck. "Your Majesty," Catherine whispered to the damp stone floor. The silence that followed was suffocating. It smelled of ozone, like the air right before a lightning strike. "This." Diana let out a short, hysterical noise, a half laugh that died in her throat. She looked at Gideon. Gideon was paralyzed. He felt the cold dampness of the room seep into his bones, replacing his blood with ice water. He stared at his mother, a woman too proud to bend to God, currently kneeling in the mud for a girl who washed their underwear. Anna didn't look heroic. She didn't look like a secret queen or a triumphant exile. She looked like a rabbit caught in a snare. She stared down at the old woman kneeling at her feet, and a single tear cut through the rain on her cheek. "I told you," Anna choked out, her voice raw with years of buried terror. "I told you never to call me that again." The grandfather clock ticked. Each swing of the brass pendulum felt like a physical blow to the back of Gideon's head. Catherine did not rise. She couldn't. The theatricality of the deep curtsy had cost her whatever strength remained in her fragile, arthritic knees. She stayed knelt in the puddle of rainwater and mud, her breathing shallow, her black mourning silk soaking up the filthy water. She looked ancient. Stripped of her rigid posture and her biting cruelty, she was just a frail old woman shivering on a stone floor. Gideon moved. He didn't think about the history of the moment. He didn't think about the impossibility of his mother's words. He only thought about the cold. He crossed the foyer in 3 long strides, his muddy boots leaving dark prints on the pale stone. He grabbed his mother by the upper arms. Her flesh felt like loose parchment over dry twigs. "Get up," Gideon rasped. He hauled her to her feet. Catherine gasped, a sharp hiss of pain as her joints locked, but she didn't take her eyes off the maid. Anna, if that was even her name, had pressed herself so hard against the stone wall that Gideon half expected her to phase through it. She was vibrating. It wasn't a tremble. It was a violent, whole-body shudder. Her hands remained curled near her chest, empty now that the leather bandbox lay crushed at her feet. "This is a joke," Diana said. Her voice was shrill, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. She plastered that awful, strained smile back onto her face, looking frantically from Gideon to Catherine. "It's a test, to see how I handle the eccentricities of the aristocracy. My father warned me. You people had strange humors." "Diana, shut up," Gideon said. He didn't raise his voice, but the absolute deadness in his tone snapped her mouth shut. He looked at Anna. "Study. Now." He didn't wait for compliance. He kept one hand firmly gripped around his mother's elbow, supporting her weight, and dragged her toward the heavy oak doors of the library. Anna followed, moving with the jerky, automated steps of a prisoner walking to the gallows. Diana trailed behind, her velvet skirts dragging heavily over the threshold, muttering about her ruined feathers. The library was cavernous and freezing. The hearth was completely empty, swept clean of ashes, a stark reminder that the Vale estate couldn't afford enough coal to heat the unused rooms. The air smelled of mildewed leather and dust. Gideon deposited his mother into a winged armchair. She sank into the faded upholstery, her hands gripping the armrests so hard, her knuckles turned white. Gideon walked directly to the globe bar in the corner. He bypassed the crystal glasses entirely, grabbing a bottle of cheap, unaged brandy and pulling the cork with his teeth. He took a long, burning swallow, straight from the neck. It tasted like copper and regret. "Explain," Gideon said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at his mother. Catherine was staring at Anna, who stood awkwardly by the empty fireplace, dripping rainwater onto the Persian rug. "It has been 6 years," Catherine whispered, her voice cracking, "since the massacre at the Summer Palace in Lotharingia. The papers said they shot the entire royal family in the courtyard. They said no one escaped the firing squads." Gideon felt the brandy curdle in his stomach. Lotharingia, the sovereign state across the channel. 6 years ago, a brutal Republican coup had wiped out the monarchy in a single, bloody night. It had been a slaughter. "They didn't shoot everyone," Anna said. Her voice was different now. The hoarse, flat affectation of the maid was gone. It was replaced by a quiet, painfully precise cadence. It was the voice of a girl who had been taught to speak by elocution masters before she learned how to scrub floors. Diana let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Are you out of your mind? Gideon, listen to this. Your mother is senile, and my maid is playing along to rob you. She is Anna from Cheapside. I hired her 3 months ago because she worked for half the wages of a proper lady's maid. I am Princess Marguerite of the House of Valois," Anna said. She didn't look at Diana. She looked at the dead ashes in the fireplace. "And your mother is not senile, Your Grace. She was my aunt's lady-in-waiting before she married your father. She knows my face, even with the scar." Anna reached up, her red, cold, chapped fingers brushing the crescent-shaped scar beneath her left eye. A piece of shrapnel from a shattered window, Gideon realized. Not a childhood accident, as maids usually claimed. "I bought passage on a smuggler's skiff," Marguerite continued, her voice devoid of emotion. "I traded my mother's pearl earrings for forged papers in London. I became Anna. Anna is invisible. Anna survives. I told you never to acknowledge me, Catherine. When I saw you at the employment agency, I specifically took the post with the Montgomerys so I could hide in plain sight. You came to my home," Catherine choked out. tears finally spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. You came to my home, dressed in rags, carrying boxes for the daughter of a merchant. The daughter of the merchant who armed the coup, Gideon realized aloud. The words dropped into the freezing room like lead weights. Diana froze. The indignant flush drained out of her face, leaving her pale and sharp. Gideon looked at his fiancée. Her father, Richard Montgomery, owned the largest steel mills in the Midlands. He manufactured everything from copper pipes to the repeating rifles that had flooded the black markets of Lotharingia 6 months before the royal family was butchered against their own palace walls. "My father is a businessman," Diana said defensively, her chin jutting out. "He sells steel. He does not pull triggers. You cannot blame him for the politics of a foreign nation. He sold the bullets that killed her family," Catherine hissed, her eyes flashing with sudden, venomous life. "And you have brought her into my house. You have brought blood money into this hall." "I brought salvation into this hall," Diana shrieked, her composure finally shattering. She pointed a trembling, gloved finger at Gideon. "Look at this place. The roof is caving in. You have no coal. You have no servants. You are bankrupt, Gideon. You begged for my father's money. You signed the contract." She rounded on Anna, who shrank back against the mantelpiece. "And you," Diana spat, "I don't care if you are the queen of the moon. You are a fraud. You are a fugitive. If my father finds out who you are, he will hand you over to the Lotharingian embassy before supper. They pay a handsome bounty for the remaining royals, I hear." Gideon stared at the bottle of brandy in his hand. The glass was cool and heavy. He had known about the rifles. Of course he had. Everyone in London knew how Richard Montgomery had made his fortune. Gideon had simply chosen to look away. He had chosen to ignore the blood on the banknotes because he needed them to repair the slate roof of his ancestral home. He had traded his morals for masonry. But looking away was easy when the victims were nameless ink in a newspaper. It was much harder when the victim was standing in your freezing library, wearing a wet, cheap wool coat, trembling in terror at the mention of the man whose fortune was supposed to save your life. "Gideon," Diana said, her voice dropping to a harsh, pragmatic register. The hysteria was gone, replaced by the ruthless business acumen she had inherited from her father. "Listen to me. This is madness. She is a maid. If she is a princess, she is a dead one. The Republicans will never let her live, and anyone who harbors her will be ruined." She stepped closer to him, her heavy lavender scent cutting through the musty smell of the library. "We leave her here," Diana commanded. "We walk out of this room. I will summon the carriage. We return to London. We get married on Saturday, as planned. My father pays off the mortgages on Highfield Hall, and you never have to think about the cold or the damp ever again. We call the authorities anonymously from the city. Let them deal with her." Gideon looked at his fiancée. She wasn't evil. She was just entirely, horrifyingly practical. It was the exact same practicality Gideon had used to justify the marriage in the first place. He looked at his mother. Catherine was weeping silently, her hands pressed to her mouth, completely destroyed by the ghosts of her past. She had loved the Lotharingian court. She had loved Marguerite's aunt. She would rather burn Highfield Hall to the ground than hand the girl over to the men who slaughtered her family. Finally, Gideon looked at Marguerite. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the doorway, calculating the distance, measuring her chances of running out into the freezing rain and disappearing back into the mud of the English countryside. She looked exhausted. She looked like a girl who had spent 6 years waiting for the bullet that had missed her in the courtyard. "If I marry you," Gideon said slowly, his voice flat, "I have to let her die." "She is already dead, Gideon," Diana snapped. "Be reasonable. You cannot save her. But you can save yourself." Gideon set the brandy bottle down on the globe bar. The glass clinked softly against the wood. He looked up at the ceiling. In the corner, a large, ugly brown water stain was spreading across the ornate plasterwork. If it rained heavily tomorrow, the plaster would finally give way and crash onto the Persian rug. The house was dying. He was dying with it. "You're right," Gideon said. Diana exhaled a sharp breath of relief. She reached out, placing a gloved hand on his forearm. "I know it is difficult, darling, but it is the only logical—" "You're right, Diana," Gideon interrupted, stepping back so her hand fell away from his coat. "The house is bankrupt. I am destitute, and your father's money would fix it all." He reached into his waistcoat pocket. He pulled out the heavy gold signet ring that bore the Vale crest. It was the only thing of value he still owned that wasn't tied up in the courts. "But I find," Gideon said, his voice dropping into a quiet, cynical exhaustion, "that I am suddenly very tired of the smell of lavender." Diana stared at him. The silence in the room stretched, taut and fragile. "What are you saying?" "I am saying the engagement is broken," Gideon said. He didn't feel heroic. He didn't feel a surge of righteous triumph. He just felt incredibly tired. "Take your ruined hats, Diana. Get back in your carriage. Go back to London. Tell your father the Duke of Vale has lost his mind." "You are a fool," Diana screamed, her face twisting in genuine shock and rage. "My father will ruin you. He will buy your debts from the bank and evict you himself. You will freeze to death in this miserable ruin." "Probably," Gideon agreed dryly. "But I will do it quietly. Get out." Diana stood frozen for a long moment, waiting for him to break, waiting for the aristocratic pride to crumble under the weight of impending poverty. But Gideon just looked at her with dead, empty eyes. With a strangled cry of fury, Diana gathered her heavy silk skirts. She spun on her heel and stormed out of the library. They listened to the sharp, angry clack of her heels against the stone foyer. They listened to the heavy front doors drag open and then slam shut with a violent boom that rattled the window panes. A few minutes later, the dull, rhythmic rattling of the carriage wheels started up again, crunching over the gravel, fading slowly into the relentless sound of the rain. The library was entirely silent. Gideon picked up the brandy bottle again. He took another drink. It didn't taste any better the second time. He turned around. His mother was still slumped in the armchair, her eyes closed, breathing heavily. Marguerite had finally moved away from the fireplace. She stood in the center of the room, her wet gray coat dripping onto the carpet, staring at Gideon in absolute disbelief. "Why did you do that?" Marguerite asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You just threw away your entire estate for a maid you met 3 hours ago." "I threw away my estate because I despise her father," Gideon lied smoothly, walking over to the hearth. He kicked at the cold, dead ashes with the toe of his muddy boot. "And because my mother would never let me sleep again if I sold you to the embassy." Marguerite wrapped her arms around her chest, shivering violently as the damp chill of the room finally sank into her bones. "They will come for the house, the bank, her father." "Let them," Gideon said. He looked around the decaying, freezing room. He thought about the empty coal bins and the leaking roof. He thought about the ruin he had just guaranteed for himself. Then he looked back at the deposed queen, shivering in a ruined coat, alive, despite the entire world trying to put her in the ground. "We have a lot of timber on the estate," Gideon said quietly. "We can chop our own firewood. You can stay in the east wing, Marguerite. It's drafty, but no one will look for you there." Marguerite stared at him, the hardened, hunted look in her eyes finally cracking. She didn't say thank you. She didn't curtsy. She just nodded once, a sharp, ragged motion, and sank to the floor in front of the dead fireplace, burying her face in her hands as the first true, silent sobs of her exile finally tore their way out of her chest. Gideon didn't offer her a handkerchief. He just leaned against the mantelpiece, listening to the rain beat against the glass, wondering how long it would take for the roof to finally cave in. Did Gideon make the right choice, Or did he just trade a miserable marriage for a cold, hungry winter? When survival is on the line, does honor actually matter? Or is it just a luxury for the rich? Let us know what you think of Gideon's cynical sacrifice in the comments below. If this gritty, grounded story kept you hooked, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more raw historical drama.